Okay, so we've created a test method called test_create_user, and this test method sends HTTP post request to /users, and this HTTP post request contains user details and one address in a list. And we have tested that this HTTP post request successfully inserts a new record in our database. Now we have validated that the user ID is not null, and this worked. Now let's validate that the address record is also inserted in our database, and that the address record is then also returned back with the response. So to do that, we will need to work with JSON, and there are a couple of ways how we can validate JSON response, and I'm going to show you my favorite, which is basically taking the response string and then converting that response string to a JSON object, and then simply working with the JSON object and getting anything that we want from it. For example, now when I have response object, I can convert that response object to a string and assign it to a new string object. Like, for example, let me call it body string equals response, and then I will get body from it, and then I will convert entire response body to a string. Now when I have this body string, I can convert entire body string into a JSON object. So I will use JSON object, and then I will call it response body JSON equals new JSON object, and I will create a JSON object out of this body string. Now let me import JSON object, and this will come from org JSON. Let's move mouse over. We'll need to surround it with the try and catch like this. Okay, so now when we have JSON object, we can get the addresses from that JSON object, and addresses is going to be a list because addresses is an array list. So I'm going to use response body JSON to get a JSON array out of it. So I'll say addresses equals response body JSON get JSON array, and then I will need to provide a JSON key, and in our case it's called addresses. To include addresses into user details, we use addresses, and when our API responds back with user details, it will also use addresses key to hold the list of addresses. So I'm getting JSON array using a key addresses. So let me import JSON array also from org JSON, and now I can validate this JSON array. I can make sure that it's not null, and then I can make sure that this addresses array has a specific length. For example, it is equal to 1 or 2 elements depending on how many addresses I have put into user details for them to be inserted in our database. Okay, so let's validate. I will use assert not null addresses. So I want to make sure that this addresses is not null. Now I will assert true, and I will check for lengths. Addresses length equals 1 because I know that I have stored only one address object in my list. If I put 2 addresses into this addresses list, then I should be asserting for 2. But at this moment it's only 1, so let me assert it for 1. And because I have addresses inside of JSON array, I can get a specific address by accessing this object using array index, and then make sure that, for example, address ID is not null. So to get a specific element from JSON array, I will use addresses, and then I will get JSON object from list of addresses, which is located at index 0. And now I will have only one address record, which is going to be a JSON object. And now I can get a specific JSON key. So I will get a string by a key, and the key is address ID. And I will assign it to a string address ID like this. Now I have JSON object. From that JSON object, I read address ID, and I can validate that my address ID is not null, and I can even validate that this address ID, I think I made a typo, and now I can even validate that my address ID is equal to specific length. Like I know when I was creating user ID or address ID, for the length of the value I used 30. So I can use assert true and then use address ID length equals 30. And same I can apply to user ID. I know that my user ID should be equal to 30. I will copy user ID and paste it here. So the user ID length should be equal to 30. And if it's not 30, then my test should fail. Okay. And also if exception takes place, I don't want to print stuck trace. I want to fail the test. And I will fail it with the exception message, get message, like this. Okay. So we are done with this test. We can run and see if it passes. So first of all, I will start up my application. So I will run it as Spring Boot app. This will start up my web services API. Let me look at the console. Now it has started and I'm ready to run this test, which will send HTTP post request, insert user details, and it will insert addresses into database. And then my API will respond back to this HTTP post request with user details and addresses, and I'm going to validate it. So I'm going to run as JUnit test and see if it passes. Here we go. The bar is green. My unit test passed. Okay. If I run it again, it will fail because the record now exists. So let's run it again. Now it has failed. And what I can also do, I can now add one more address. Let's say we are adding billing address. So that will be billing. And all the address details will stay the same except type. So that will be billing address. And I will add this billing address to the list of addresses as well. And now I will validate that the list of addresses which is returned back with the response is equal to 2 instead. So I'll scroll down here, and where I validate for list of addresses, I'm going to validate for 2 addresses. I want to make sure that both addresses are then returned back with the response to this API call. And because I already have this record in the database, I can either change email address here so that a new record is inserted as a new user, or I can stop my application and that will clear the data from my in-memory database, and I will start it again, run as Spring Boot app, and then simply run my JUnit test one more time. So let's make sure that application started. It now started, and let's run this JUnit test and see if it passes. Okay, so it has passed, and if I look at the console, expand it a little bit, I should see that incoming, here we go, the incoming JSON response will contain the user ID, and if I scroll a little bit to the right, it will contain addresses, and it should contain 2 address records in its array. So this is one address record, and this is the second address record. Okay, so it's working. Let's continue.